There is a weapon on the modern battlefield that makes no sound, leaves no crater, and produces no visible flash. But its effects can be more devastating than any artillery barrage. It does not kill soldiers directly. It does something worse. It isolates them. It severs the invisible threads of communication that connect a soldier to his commander, a forward observer to his artillery battery, a platoon to its battalion, a battalion to its brigade. It turns an organized military force into a collection of frightened individuals who cannot coordinate, cannot call for help, and cannot understand what is happening around them. That weapon is electronic warfare. And just days ago, Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists used it to dismantle an entire Russian brigade across 30 kilometers of front line in eastern Ukraine, triggering 48 hours of chaos, destruction, and collapse that left the Russian formation a shattered remnant of what it had been. The operation was not a single dramatic strike. It was something far more sophisticated and far more terrifying for the soldiers on the receiving end. It was the systematic severing of every electronic connection that held a modern military formation together, followed by the patient, methodical destruction of the disconnected pieces one by one, while the Russian soldiers inside them screamed into radios that produced nothing but static and stared at screens that showed nothing but noise. This is the story of the battle that Russia's soldiers never saw coming, because by the time it began, they could no longer see anything at all. The operation had been planned for weeks. Ukrainian signals intelligence units had spent months monitoring Russian communications in the sector, cataloging the frequencies used by different Russian units, mapping the locations of command posts and relay stations, identifying the types of radios, satellite phones, and drone control links that Russian forces relied upon. Every transmission was recorded, analyzed, and filed. Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists built a comprehensive picture of the Russian brigade's entire communications architecture. Every frequency, every encryption pattern, every backup channel, every vulnerability. And there were many vulnerabilities. Confirmed intelligence analysis revealed that the Russian brigade was operating with a patchwork of communications equipment. A mix of modern encrypted radios, older analog systems, civilian satellite phones purchased by soldiers with their own money, and even commercial walkie-talkies used by some platoons whose military radios had broken down and never been replaced. This was not a communications network. It was a fragile web of improvised solutions held together by habit and hope. Ukrainian electronic warfare planners identified the critical nodes: the brigade's primary command frequency, the backup channels used when the primary was busy or compromised, the satellite phone numbers used by senior officers for secure communications, the control frequencies used by Russian reconnaissance drones, the data links connecting forward observers to artillery batteries. Every thread in the web was mapped, and for each one, Ukrainian specialists prepared a targeted jamming solution. The operation launched at 0300 hours on a cold, overcast night, conditions that grounded most aircraft and reduced visibility to near zero. Perfect conditions for what was about to happen. Across a front of 30 kilometers, Ukrainian electronic warfare vehicles, mobile platforms carrying powerful jamming transmitters, activated simultaneously. The effect was instantaneous and total. Every Russian radio frequency in the sector was flooded with noise. Every satellite phone link was disrupted. Every drone control signal was overwhelmed. In the space of a few seconds, the Russian brigade went from a connected, communicating military formation to a collection of isolated units that could not talk to each other, could not talk to their command, and could not talk to anyone. Stay with this story. What the Ukrainian military did next, while Russian soldiers sat in their positions unable to communicate, was methodical, devastating, and represents a new chapter in modern warfare. The first phase was artillery. Within minutes of the jamming activation, Ukrainian artillery batteries, pre-positioned and pre-loaded with firing coordinates calculated during the weeks of intelligence preparation, opened fire across the entire Russian front. The targets had been selected with surgical precision. Command posts, ammunition storage points, vehicle parks, communications relay stations, and troop concentrations that had been identified through weeks of drone surveillance and signals intercepts. The effect of artillery striking positions whose occupants cannot communicate is qualitatively different from a standard bombardment. Under normal circumstances, when a Russian position is hit by artillery, The survivors immediately radio for help. They call for counter-battery fire, request medical evacuation, report the direction and intensity of the shelling, and coordinate with adjacent units to prepare for a possible ground assault. Communication transforms a local event into a coordinated response. Without communication, there is no coordination. There is only isolation and fear. At each Russian position struck by Ukrainian artillery, the sequence was the same. Shells impacting, explosions, casualties, survivors scrambling for their radios and hearing nothing but static. Grabbing satellite phones, no signal. Attempting to launch reconnaissance drones to locate the Ukrainian guns, the drones refusing to connect to their controllers, spinning helplessly on the ground or veering off course the moment they lifted off. The Russian soldiers could not determine where the fire was coming from. They could not warn other positions. They could not request counter-battery fire. They could not call for reinforcements. They could not do anything except endure, which is more terrifying for a soldier, being attacked by an enemy you can see, or being shelled while completely cut off from every form of communication and support. Tell us in the comments. The Ukrainian artillery worked through a pre-planned target list over the first 6 hours. Position after position was struck, some with high explosive rounds, others with cluster munitions, others with precision-guided shells that hit specific buildings, vehicles, or bunker entrances. Russian losses mounted with each hour, and at every position the story was the same. No warning, no communication, no response. But the artillery was only the first phase. The second phase began at dawn. Ukrainian infantry units, pre-positioned along the 30-kilometer front, launched coordinated advances against Russian positions that intelligence had identified as most weakened by the overnight bombardment. These were not full-scale assaults. They were targeted penetrations, small, fast, aggressive pushes by Ukrainian assault groups into specific sectors where the Russian defenders were expected to be disoriented, depleted, and unable to call for support. The Ukrainian infantry advanced behind a screen of FPV drones, not for strikes, but for reconnaissance. Ukrainian drones were unaffected by the jamming because Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists had carefully designed their jamming patterns to create protected corridors, frequency windows that allowed Ukrainian communications and drone operations to function normally while Russian systems remained suppressed. This asymmetric advantage was the product of months of technical preparation, and it gave Ukrainian forces a decisive edge. They could see, communicate, and coordinate while the Russians could not. At one position on the northern end of the sector, a Ukrainian assault group advanced into a Russian trench system that had been struck by artillery 4 hours earlier. The Russian soldiers inside, approximately 30 men from a motorized rifle company, had suffered casualties from the shelling and had been unable to contact their battalion command post to report their status or request reinforcement. When the Ukrainian soldiers appeared at the edge of their position, the Russian defenders were disorganized, leaderless. Their company commander had been killed in the bombardment and psychologically shattered by hours of isolation. 18 Russian soldiers surrendered. The remainder fled east. At another position near the center of the sector, Ukrainian forces encountered stiffer resistance. A Russian platoon that had escaped the worst of the bombardment had organized a defensive position and was prepared to fight. But without communication, they had no idea that the positions on their flanks had already fallen. Ukrainian assault teams approached from 3 directions, the front and both flanks, and the Russian platoon found itself surrounded without having received any warning. After a 30-minute firefight, the Russian position was overwhelmed. 22 Russian soldiers were killed and 11 were captured. Look at the pattern. Every Russian position that fell followed the same sequence: isolation through jamming, degradation through artillery, and then destruction or capture by Ukrainian ground forces who moved with full situational awareness against an enemy operating blind. The Russian soldiers were not lacking in weapons or ammunition. Many of them fought bravely, but bravery without information is simply a slower form of dying. Without communication, the Russian brigade could not concentrate its forces, could not coordinate its defense, and could not mount the kind of organized resistance that might have slowed the Ukrainian advance. The jamming continued for a full 48 hours. During that time, the Russian brigade attempted multiple countermeasures. Officers sent runners, soldiers physically carrying messages between positions on foot, like armies did a century ago. But the distances were too great, the terrain too dangerous, and many of the runners were intercepted by Ukrainian drones or patrols operating between Russian positions. Some Russian units attempted to move their radios to different frequencies, but Ukrainian electronic warfare systems, monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum in real time, detected each frequency shift and jammed the new channels within minutes. A small number of Russian officers managed brief satellite phone connections during momentary gaps in the jamming, but these calls were intercepted by Ukrainian signals intelligence, providing real-time updates on the state of Russian confusion and the locations of surviving command elements. How long do you think a modern military unit can operate effectively without any communications? A. A few hours. B. 12-24 hours. C. It cannot function at all. Drop your answer below. By the end of the 48 hours, the Russian brigade had ceased to function as a coherent military formation. Confirmed battlefield reports, intercepted communications captured during brief signal windows, and post-operation satellite imagery analysis paint a comprehensive picture of the destruction. But before we count the losses, consider what those 48 hours looked like for the Russian soldiers who lived through them. At one forward outpost on the southern end of the sector, a Russian platoon of approximately 25 soldiers endured 16 hours of intermittent artillery strikes without any ability to communicate with their company headquarters, located just 4 kilometers to the rear. The platoon leader, a junior lieutenant, sent 3 runners to the company command post to request ammunition resupply and medical evacuation for wounded soldiers. The first runner was killed by a Ukrainian FPV drone 200 meters from the outpost. The second made it to the company position only to discover it had been hit by artillery and abandoned. The third never returned, his fate unknown. The platoon, cut off and bleeding, eventually abandoned the position at nightfall and attempted to walk to the Russian rear. They were intercepted by a Ukrainian patrol, and 15 of the 25 surrendered. The others scattered into the darkness. At another position, a Russian mortar battery that had been firing on Ukrainian lines for weeks, the crews found themselves unable to receive fire missions from forward observers. Without communication, the mortar teams had no targets, no coordinates, no adjustments. They sat idle beside their weapons while Ukrainian infantry advanced past positions they should have been defending with fire. When Ukrainian assault teams reached the mortar battery 16 hours into the operation, the crews had already abandoned the position, leaving behind 420mm mortar systems, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and personal equipment scattered in the haste of their departure. The most devastating single engagement occurred at a Russian battalion command post near the center of the sector. The command post, located in a basement of a partially destroyed building, was one of the primary targets of the Ukrainian artillery plan. But the initial bombardment did not destroy it. The building was hit, but the basement survived, and the Russian battalion staff, approximately 15 officers and communications specialists, were alive but trapped in an information vacuum. Their radios produced only static. Their satellite terminal showed no connection. Their drone operators reported that every aircraft they launched lost signal within seconds of takeoff and either crashed or flew in random directions until their batteries died. The battalion commander, a major, made the decision to physically relocate his command post to a secondary position 3 kilometers to the rear, where he hoped communications might be restored. The move required loading equipment into vehicles and driving along a road that crossed open terrain. Ukrainian surveillance drones, operating freely in the jamming-protected frequency corridors, spotted the convoy the moment it left the building. A Ukrainian HIMARS battery, waiting for exactly this type of target, fired a precision salvo. The rockets struck the convoy on the road. The battalion commander's vehicle was hit directly. According to intercepted Russian communications that briefly broke through during a jamming gap. Hours later, the major was confirmed killed, along with his operations officer and 3 communications specialists. The Russian battalion, already blind and deaf, was now also leaderless. This single strike cascaded through the Russian formation. The battalion's 3 companies, each already isolated by the jamming, now lost their last connection to higher command. Company commanders who had been waiting for orders, hoping the silence was temporary, realized that no orders were coming. Some attempted to organize local defenses on their own initiative. Others, lacking the experience or confidence to make independent decisions, simply held in place and waited, while Ukrainian forces maneuvered around them. The human toll of 48 hours without communication extended beyond the physical casualties. Intercepted fragments of Russian radio traffic, captured during momentary breaks in the jamming, revealed a force on the edge of psychological collapse. Soldiers begging for information, officers demanding to know why no one was responding, wounded men calling for evacuation that could not be coordinated, and perhaps most tellingly, multiple intercepts of Russian soldiers attempting to contact family members on personal cell phones, unaware that Ukrainian electronic warfare had jammed civilian frequencies as well. These soldiers were not trying to fight, they were trying to say goodbye. Personnel losses confirmed. Approximately 400 to 500 Russian soldiers killed, wounded or captured across the 30-kilometer front, representing roughly 30% of the brigade's estimated strength of 1,500 personnel. The losses were concentrated among forward units that bore the brunt of both the artillery bombardment and the infantry assaults. But rear area support units also suffered casualties from Ukrainian long-range strikes on logistics and command positions. Equipment destroyed. An estimated 12 to 15 artillery pieces silenced, either destroyed by counter-battery fire or abandoned by crews who fled positions they could no longer coordinate. 8 to 12 armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. 3 confirmed command posts destroyed, 2 communications relay stations destroyed. Multiple ammunition and fuel storage points hit, with secondary explosions observed by Ukrainian surveillance drones. Territorial losses. Ukrainian forces advanced between 500 meters and 2 kilometers across the 30-kilometer front, capturing multiple Russian trench lines, observation posts, and fortified positions. These gains may appear modest on a map, but in the context of a war where frontline movement is often measured in meters, a 2-kilometer advance across a wide front represents a significant tactical victory. Is electronic warfare the most underrated weapon of this war? Or is it the weapon that will ultimately decide the outcome? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now the economics. The Russian brigade's communications equipment, the radios, satellite terminals, relay stations, encryption devices, and antenna systems that were either destroyed by Ukrainian strikes or rendered useless by the jamming, represents an estimated loss of $3 to $5 million. Replacing this equipment is not merely a matter of cost, it requires production capacity that Russia's defense industry is already struggling to maintain. The artillery losses are particularly significant. 12 to 15 artillery pieces, a mix of towed howitzers, self-propelled guns, and mortar systems, represent a loss of approximately $15 to $30 million, depending on the specific systems destroyed. More importantly, each destroyed artillery piece reduces the volume of fire that Russian forces can bring to bear on Ukrainian positions, degrading Russia's primary tactical advantage on the front line. The personnel losses carry their weight in training investment. 400 to 500 casualties at an average training and equipping cost of $30,000 to $50,000 per soldier represent approximately $15 to $25 million in human capital destroyed. The experienced soldiers, NCOs, and junior officers among the casualties are irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. The armored vehicles, command post equipment, ammunition stores, and fuel supplies add another estimated $5 to $10 million to the total. Total estimated Russian losses from the 48-hour electronic warfare operation. Communications equipment destroyed or compromised, $3 to $5 million. Artillery systems destroyed, $15 to $30 million. Armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned, $4 to $6 million. Personnel losses, $15 to $25 million. Ammunition and fuel stores destroyed, $3 to $5 million. Command post and relay station equipment, $2 to $4 million. Territorial positions lost, operational cost to reconstitute, estimated at $5 to $8 million. Total, $47 to $83 million. The cost of the Ukrainian electronic warfare operation, the jamming equipment, the electricity to power it, the signals intelligence preparation, the coordination with artillery and infantry units, is estimated at approximately $1 to $2 million. Add the cost of artillery ammunition and FPV drones used during the operation, and the total Ukrainian expenditure rises to approximately $5 to $8 million. $5 million to inflict $83 million in damage. A cost-exchange ratio of 10 to 16 to 1 in Ukraine's favor. And unlike a kinetic strike that destroys a single target, the electronic warfare operation degraded the combat capability of an entire brigade across a 30-kilometer front, a scale of impact that no single missile or drone strike could achieve. If facts like these expose the reality behind Russian propaganda, type truth in the comments. What should Ukraine develop next? More electronic warfare systems, more drones, or more artillery? Tell us below. The Russian brigade was eventually pulled back from the front line and replaced by a fresh formation. But the replacement took over a week to complete, during which Ukrainian forces continued to consolidate their gains and strengthen their new positions. The withdrawn brigade was assessed as combat ineffective and would require weeks of reconstitution, new personnel, new equipment, new communications gear, and new leadership before it could return to the fight. The Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists who planned and executed this operation represent a capability that Russia cannot match and cannot counter with the tools it currently possesses. Russia's communications infrastructure in Ukraine is a patchwork of aging equipment, civilian improvisation, and declining production capacity. Ukraine's electronic warfare capability is growing, supported by domestic innovation, Western technology partnerships, and battlefield experience that no training exercise can replicate. Every Russian brigade on the front line in Ukraine operates with the same fundamental vulnerability. It depends on electromagnetic communications to function as a coordinated military force. And every one of those brigades now knows, or will soon learn, that Ukrainian electronic warfare units can sever those communications at will, at a time and place of Ukraine's choosing, and hold them silent long enough for Ukrainian artillery and infantry to turn isolation into annihilation. 3 questions before you go. First, if Ukrainian electronic warfare can silence an entire Russian brigade for 48 hours, enabling the destruction of 30% of its force, what happens when Ukraine scales this capability to cover multiple sectors simultaneously? Second, Russia's communications equipment is a mix of military and civilian systems, many of them aging and unreliable. As Ukraine's electronic warfare technology advances, at what point does Russian battlefield communication become permanently unreliable? And what happens to an army that cannot talk to itself? Third, the 48-hour window of silence cost Russia up to $83 million and an entire brigade's combat effectiveness. How many more windows like this can Russia afford? And how many is Ukraine preparing right now? Think about that. Subscribe to Steel Command, share this video. The loudest weapon in this war makes no sound. It simply cuts the line between a Russian soldier and his command, and let silence do the rest. The world needs to understand this.